Now, Mr. Chair, if you allow me, I'd like to introduce John Lott, Jr. is an economist and a world-recognized expert on guns and crime. Lott has held research or teaching positions at various academic institutions, including the University of Chicago, Yale University, the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, Stanford University, and Rice University, and was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission during 1988 and 1989. He has authored 8 books, including More Guns, Less Crime, and is currently a Fox News columnist. He holds a PhD in economics from UCLA. There is not a person known anywhere in this country that knows more about gun statistics and why crimes happen than John Lott. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that you would introduce him up to the stand.
Yes, Dr. Lott, please come forward.
Say something?
Yep.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation from both Senator Jones and Senator Green to be here today. Would you like me to make a statement?
Go ahead, sir.
I'm here as president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. It's basically a group of academics from around the country who have expertise in the issue of crime and gun and police type issues. There are 3 main points that I want to try to go through. One is the behavior of permit holders. Second one is concerns about the risks of allowing permit holders to go and carry in certain places, such as universities. And the third point is to go and address the issue of possible benefits from people being able to go and carry. With regard to the behavior of permit holders, as Senator Green said, one thing is very clear is how incredibly law-abiding they are. If you look at Michigan, for example, you're talking about tenths of percentage point that get revoked for any particular reason. If you look at firearms revocations, firearms-related reasons, you're talking about thousandths of 1 percentage point. And that's true whether you look at other states as well. It's hard to find any other group in the population that has as low of conviction rates for misdemeanors or felonies. Permit holders actually even have lower rates of convictions or arrests for misdemeanors or felonies than police officers do. Police officers are convicted of misdemeanors or felonies about 1/30th the rate of the general population, and concealed carry permit holders are convicted at a rate about 1/6 or 1/7 the rate that police officers are. Now, we have a lot of experience with people being able to go and carry concealed handguns on university campuses or other places. If you look at universities and colleges, for example, 11 states now mandate that public universities allow people with concealed carry permits to carry, though they vary in terms of what people are allowed to do. There are 21 states which leave it up to individual schools to decide, though in most of those cases they don't allow it. One school where they do allow it is right nearby here, Michigan State University. And if you look at K through 12 schools, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, you have 20 states that to varying degrees allow people to carry permitted concealed handguns on college campuses. And what you find is that these individuals are extremely law-abiding. There's certain concerns that come up. One is, do any of these permit holders, when they're on places that they're allowed to carry, commit crimes? And with regard to universities and colleges, I can't find one single example where a permit holder who was allowed to carry there committed some type of crime while they were carrying. Another issue is accidents. And over the decades that I've looked at this, I've been able to identify 5 accidents, 4 of them involving colleges, 1 involving a K through 12 situation. Colleges, they're in Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Mississippi. All of those involved accidental firings, but there were no fatalities, basically relatively minor injuries in each of those cases. And the one K through 12 accidental shooting, there was a trivial injury that resulted. I've also provided a report where we go through, the Crime Prevention Research Center looks at the behavior of college-age students compared to others in the population. We had data for Texas, Michigan, and Nevada. And in fact, what you find there is that college-age permit holders are basically just as law-abiding as people of other ages. Now, with regard to the second point about concerns about the risks involving concealed carry permit holders and mass shootings, basically when you read debates in state legislatures about allowing people to carry, there's a couple issues that come up. One is the concerns that when a mass public shooting occurs, a permit holder may accidentally shoot a bystander. A second concern that comes up regularly is that when the police arrive on the scene, they may accidentally shoot the permit holder. I can identify several dozen mass public shootings that have clearly been stopped by concealed carry permit holders, and there's not one single example where either of those two types of instances occur. Are they possible? Sure, they're possible. But it seems to me, just like in the other cases, in talking about how law-abiding permit holders are, the ultimate way of trying to address this and answer this question is just to look at past behavior. Finally, I'd like to just talk about the benefits. And Senator Green alluded to this briefly when he was talking about where these types of attacks occur. If you look since 1950, with just two exceptions, every single one of the mass public shootings in the United States have taken place where permanent concealed handguns are not allowed for general citizens to be able to go and carry. In Europe, in every single case that you can point to a mass public shooting, they've occurred where guns are banned in so-called gun-free zones. But it's more than that. You know, it's not just the fact that these obviously aren't random. I mean, Michigan, you can carry a permanent concealed handgun any place. If attacks were random in Michigan or most of these other concealed carry states, then 98% or so of these attacks would be occurring in places where permanent concealed handguns are allowed. Instead, they keep on occurring time after time in those very small areas within the state where permanent concealed handguns are not allowed. But it goes beyond that. One just needs to look at the explicit statements that these killers make in their diaries or videotapes or other things that they leave. Just look at this year. You have the Charleston killer. His first target was actually going to be Charleston College. But apparently, after he investigated it, he was concerned about the amount of armed security that they had there, and so he decided not to attack. Look at the diary that was released this summer from the Batman movie theater shooter during his trial. One of the things that became clear there was that his first choice of targets was actually going to be an airport. But again, when he investigated, he was concerned about the amount of armed security there, and he decided not to do it. Where did he end up attacking? Movie theaters. But if you look at the movie theaters, the 7 movie theaters that were within a 20-minute drive of his apartment, only one of those posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. He didn't go to the movie theaters that were closest to his home. He didn't go to the movie theater that advertised itself prominently as having the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado, which you think would be attractive to somebody who's going on the premiere of a Batman movie to go and get as many possible victims as he could. Instead, he went to the single movie theater that posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. If you look at the mall shootings around the country, in Omaha and Kansas City, Salt Lake City, time after time, it'd be that lone mall that posts a sign where you see the person go and do the attack, even if it's the farthest one from his home. Now, and it's just not this year. You can look at the Santa Barbara shooter from last year. I'm reading his 141-page manifesto where he makes exactly the same types of calculations, and it's just not in the United States. You can look at the Canadian killer in Moncton, New Brunswick last year, where he had comics up on his Facebook page making fun of gun-free zones that were there. Really chilling comics there that foretold the type of attack that he was going to do. Now, there's one important point that I want to make, and that is police are extremely important, but they face a very difficult job in stopping these mass public shootings. Armed guards in uniform face the same thing. And that is, it's very hard to be on guard hour after hour, day after day, month after month. And when you're in uniform, you give the attackers a huge strategic advantage. They have the choice of either killing the person in uniform first, waiting for the person in uniform to go and leave the scene, or picking another venue where they don't have to worry about somebody in uniform being stationed there. The reason why I bring this up is twofold. One, to acknowledge the importance of police, but to recognize their limits, but also to deal with this issue of open carry, which seems to be involved with in this case. And that is, people who carry openly face the same type of strategic limitations that uniformed officers and police do in this case. And so you can eliminate the strategic advantage that these killers or terrorists have by having somebody with a concealed handgun, because then if you have 50 people there, the killer doesn't know who might be able to stop him, whether it's somebody in front or the side. They don't know who they're supposed to take out first. And finally, I'd like to just leave on some comments by Ron Noble, who's Secretary General of Interpol, kind of Europe's version of the FBI, though they cover the entire world. After the Westland Mall shooting in Kenya a couple years ago, Ron Noble made the statement about how his views have changed on gun control over the years. When he first became Secretary General of Interpol, he said the obvious solution to him was simply to ban guns in areas. But what he learned is that it's really virtually impossible to make sure that guns don't get into an area. When you're talking about people who are planning these types of attacks months or even years in advance, when you're talking about soft targets involving civilians, putting things like metal detectors or other things there simply aren't foolproof in stopping these guys, whether it be like the Colorado shooter, being able to prop open a door in the back of the theater in order to bring in guns or other things. They'll find some way to be able to go and bring guns in there. So he said there's basically two things. One is you can create a really gun-free zone, but he said it's impossible to do that. Or you can let people be able to go and defend themselves. Because he said, if you go and try to create a gun-free zone, the people who obey these rules are the law-abiding good citizens, not the criminals. And rather than making it more difficult for the criminals, you actually make it easier. And just to think about this, just a simple question, is if anybody here was stalked or threatened by a criminal, would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said this home is a gun-free zone? My guess is nobody would do that. I've debated lots of gun control advocates over the years, and none of them have been willing to say they'd put up a sign like that. And the reason is obvious, is that the sign won't deter them. If anything, it serves as a magnet because they know it's relatively easier to go and attack people that are unarmed there. It's the same reason why all these mass public killers keep on leaving statements in diaries and other places indicating why they chose the venue that they did to go and do the attack. So I greatly appreciate your time here, and if there are any questions, I'd be very happy to try to answer them. But thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for coming here. I appreciate your testimony, and obviously there's a lot of people that probably disagree with what you have to say. But I'd like to understand where you're coming from a little bit. First of all, you're talking about these the shooters that have used this as a rationale for choosing these targets because they're a gun-free zone, but in a lot of these cases, they're not. The situation in Oregon, there's stories about people that actually had concealed weapons there and didn't refuse, they were not close enough to where the action was happening because they were law enforcement, or one was a veteran that had a concealed weapon permit. And it goes back to both ways. I mean, you know, like a lot of these are events because there's a lot of people in a room, so they'll go to where there's crowds. Gun-free zones tend to be stadiums, bars, things of that nature in the state. And I guess you've given us some anecdotal evidence, but you've not really given us, and maybe you have that, and that's why I'm asking this question, comparing those states that have much more open laws on carrying guns or concealed weapons versus those states that don't. And for that matter, you look at other countries like Canada or Australia, and maybe those often also may show a place to go on this as well. But I'm really concerned about this issue because I think everybody in this room whether you agree with this legislation or don't agree with this legislation, I'm very concerned about what we see happening across this nation. And
Right.
there needs to be some way to address it, but also taking the emotion out of it, taking the fear out of it to understand the semantics. And I'm just wondering what kind of evidence that you actually have on this.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to go through the points. You've raised many different points there. Let's just take them in order. The Oregon case was, in fact, a gun-free zone. Under Oregon law, you're technically allowed to go and carry a gun on school property if you're a concealed carry permit holder. But what's happened there is that the public universities and schools there have done two things. One is they have it in both the faculty and student handbooks that ban people, either a student or a faculty, to have a gun, a water pistol, a BB gun, a gun that fires rubber bands, or a firearm from having them any place on school property. Now, it's true it's not a criminal offense, but if you're a faculty member and you violate that rule, you will be fired. There's an appeals court case from 2009 that upheld the firing of a public school teacher because it was in the employment contract that was there. So they've gotten around the rule like that. And the same thing is true for students, and they will be expelled. Now, those are real penalties. If you're a faculty member and you get fired for a firearms-related violation, your academic career is over. The chances of you being able to go get another academic job someplace in the United States from another university after being fired for a firearms-related violation is essentially zero. For a student, it's essentially the same thing. If they get expelled for a firearms-related violation, they're not going to get admitted to another college. If you don't have your BA or BS yet, then you're basically going to have to accept the fact that you're going to go through life without getting a college degree. Now, there's a 2011 case by an appeals court in Oregon that also addressed this issue, because in theory, somebody with a concealed handgun permit could carry as long as they're neither students nor faculty. But what the appeals court said, that even permit holders who were neither students nor faculty could be banned by the schools from carrying in any university buildings. And that would include parking structures or buildings. So in fact, where this attack occurred, no one, neither a student, faculty, or somebody who was unconnected with the school, would have been allowed to go and carry in the building where it was. Now, it's true that one veteran broke the rule, okay, and essentially had a gun, he said, at some other part on campus. I have no reason to doubt him doing that. But what I will say is that when you look at this data, these concealed carry permit holders are unbelievably law-abiding. I mean, it's hard to find any other group, as I've tried to go through the numbers, and I've mentioned statistics with regard to this. And so, you know, while you may have somebody who may have broken it, you can't imagine that very many of them are going to do that. And the question is also whether in the killer's mind he sees the bans that are there and whether it would have affected him choosing that particular target or not, whether he would think that people would be likely to go and respond or not. Now, you mentioned your second point was, well, they may be going to these gun-free zones, but it's simply where, you know, the people are. Well, the problem is, look at the Colorado shooting. There were 7 movie theaters that he could have picked from, okay? The one he picked was the only one that banned permit concealed handguns. Look at the Lafayette movie theater shootings that we had earlier this year that the president just spoke about a week and a half or a couple weeks ago. The one he picked there was one that had posted signs. There were other movie theaters in the area that didn't post signs. Look at the Omaha, Nebraska shooter. You had 8 enclosed malls there. Only 1 posted signs. It was the one farthest from his home. Why did he go to the one that was farthest from his home? You just think randomness. Sometimes you're going to get these guys, they want to attack a mall, they want to go and attack a movie theater. There are lots of movie theaters that they could go to that weren't posted. So why is it time after time after time that they keep going to the ones that were posted to go and do their attacks? Why do we see in their diaries and other statements their preoccupation with whether or not people with guns there are going to be able to stop them in doing these attacks? When, you know, you read the diaries from these guys, and one thing that just comes through so clearly, they want to commit suicide, but they want to commit suicide in a way that's going to go and get them attention. okay? And they know the more people they kill, in fact, it's chilling. You read them, they say, if I can only kill more people than such and such, then I can get even more media attention. And they also know they want to avoid places where people have guns, because my research with Bill Landis at the University of Chicago, that I'm happy to make available to you, and others, show that the amount of time that elapses between an attack starting and when somebody with a gun able to arrive on the scene is very important in determining the number of people who get killed or injured in these attacks. So, you know, as far as statistical evidence that goes there, Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I have done the largest study on these mass public shootings that I know of. We looked at all the mass public shootings in the United States from 1977 through 1999. We looked at 13 different types of gun control laws, as well as hundreds of other factors that might affect them. And the only gun control law that had any impact on the rate of these mass public shootings was the passage of right-to-carry laws. And to the extent to which these attacks still occurred, as I mentioned before, they occurred in these tiny areas within the state where permanently concealed handguns weren't allowed. Now, you mentioned other places. The last point that you raised was with regard to Australia, and I believe you mentioned one other country. But, you know, just as a general point, I know the president, for example, will say, well, you know, the United States is the only country in which these types of attacks occur. That's simply false. You know, one thing you have to take into account how large the United States is. We have about 320 million people. The largest country in Europe, for example, is Germany with 81 million people. A lot of the countries there are 4 million, 8 million, 14 million people. And the thing is, you have to adjust for country size. And what you find is if you look at Europe as a whole, their rate of mass public shootings is actually fairly similar to the rate here in the United States. They don't get a lot of attention. The worst mass public shooting in history is in Norway, just a few years ago. If you ignore the bombing deaths, there were 67 people killed and 110 wounded. Germany has 2 of the 5 worst K through 12 public school shootings in the world. Europe as a whole has 4 of the 7 worst public school shootings. If you once you adjust for population, the United States would rank 9th compared to just European countries in terms of the rate of mass public shootings. And Africa and parts of Asia are much worse. Now, with regard to Australia, you know, the thing is, they didn't have a gun ban. What they did was they had a buyback of about 1/3 of the guns, and then people were able to go and buy them again. And the gun ownership rate is actually fairly similar now in Australia to what it was prior to the buyback. And, you know, there's all sorts of discussions about what happens to the crime rate in Australia, what's happened to firearm suicide rate. I gave testimony last year to the Australian Senate where I went through all these numbers for them. And in fact, if you take something like firearm murders, for example, you in fact find that it was falling for 15 years prior to the buyback and then kept on falling at the same rate after the buyback. There was no sudden drop and then an increase, which is what you would have expected if you believed in the more guns, more crime type hypothesis. And for firearm suicides, it's exactly the same. If you compare Australia to New Zealand over that same period of time, New Zealand didn't change its firearms laws in 1996 and 97, and their mass public shooting rate fell even more than Australia's did after they passed their laws. And so one of the reasons why you use U.S. data is that you just don't want to pick one state or whatever. We have all 50 states. And so Bill Landis and I, when we were looking at this, it's easier to compare lots of different places and control for similar laws and control for other factors. And we found that when states passed concealed carry laws in the areas that they were allowed to carry, you would see about a 60% drop in the rate of mass public shootings and about an 80% drop in the rate at which people were killed or injured from these attacks. So I think I hit your questions. If I missed something, please let me know.
Okay, Senator Beda, you had a brief follow-up?
Yeah, I think it's brief. And I appreciate your your testimony there, and, you know, again, I guess I was looking for real numbers statistically.
For sure.
I have something for Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and they conducted a comprehensive analysis of every mass shooting between January 2009 and August 2015 that was identifiable through FBI data and media reports. 90 of the 133 incidents, would be 67%, took place in private residences where people have the right to keep a gun. Of the 37 incidents in public spaces, at least 21 took place where concealed guns could be lawfully carried. And again, that doesn't take we get a couple of these that are pretty routine in America now. We'll get one every week or so. So it might be the most up to date, but that's, perhaps you'd like to comment. I'm sure you're familiar
Sure.
with that group. They've not
Well, look,
necessarily.
I mean, Bloomberg's groups have been called into account many times by fact-check organizations from the Washington Post to PolitiFact. Well, I'm not sure I've been hit as hard as they have been on it. But in any case, we have on our website going through their report. And the big thing that you have to understand with Bloomberg's group is they essentially looked at news reports. And if the news report didn't mention that it was a gun-free zone, they essentially assumed that it was. And the problem that you learn, anybody who deals with these types of media reports, is that the media just doesn't cover it one way or the other in most of these cases. The first AP report that I've ever seen mentioning whether an attack at a mall, in this case, had occurred at a gun-free zone was earlier this year. I just was talking to a reporter earlier today from the Fox and another one from the New York Times about the fact that they don't, even when they know it, they don't include it in these stories. And so simply to go and rely on whether a news report would include information on whether it's a gun-free zone is not very useful. What I've had to do over time, and what I do regularly, is that when an attack occurs, I will reach out to people in those areas to see if we can get, because there's basically two different types of places. There are places through legislation we know are gun-free zones. Those are easy to go and find. But then there are also places where private parties are allowed to post. And so what you have to do then is essentially go and have somebody check on the facility, actually go there to go and see whether or not the place was posted. Now, it'd be easy, you know, sometimes, like when the Chattanooga military attack occurred earlier this year, it's kind of hard to miss it when, you know, the news reports have it on the front door of the place, a gun-free zone sign that's there. But for most of these places, you actually have to have somebody go there and take pictures of that. And so for the different mall shootings and for other types of cases, if you go to my websites, what you'll find is that we've gone and actually done the hard work of tracking down and sending people there to go and take pictures of the outside of those facilities to see whether or not they were posted or not. And that's nothing that the Bloomberg people do. They think they can go back 3 or 4 years or 5 years later after the attack and just go and look at a news report and just determine from that whether or not it was a gun-free zone. And they've been pointed out to them. They don't seem to care one way or the other on trying to fix the past reports that they have.
Okay, well, thank you, Doctor, for answering all those questions. We have one from Senator Kobeck.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lott. I appreciate that you go to the source data and you just don't rely on the abstracts. That's very important whenever we address any typical issue. But I want to thank Senator Green for bringing up this bill for our consideration. It seems like it's driven by 2 key points. Number one, we have a constitutional right to defend ourselves, and it doesn't have an exception clause associated with it. That's Article 1, Section 6 of our Michigan Constitution. Number two, the data clearly shows that we have increased public safety when people are allowed to carry guns in different areas. And so it's an extension of that First Amendment right. And I was wondering, Dr. Lott, if you could briefly just kind of highlight specifically in the case of what are the key data points? I mean, anecdotally, you talked about the top school shootings across the board. And across the world, excuse me. Can you kind of zero in on what you think is the key data point that demonstrates that it's safer for us to actually allow concealed carry in our current gun-free zones than to actually turn them into the gun-free zones?
Right. Well, I'd like to say I wasn't really just making anecdotal statements. When I would go and say, look, here are possible concerns, you know, do permit holders, you know, create crimes when they're allowed in certain areas or not? That's simply I looked at all the data for the entire United States, could not identify one case, so it's not like I'm taking a news story there. I'm just saying here's all the data that's available on this. When you go and you look at these mass public shootings in general, you know, the thing is, I don't know how you can't look at all this data and not come away stunned by just seeing how time after time they keep on occurring in places where guns are not allowed. And, you know, now the anecdotal part may be the statements from these killers, but I'm not just trying to pick one or two statements. What I can go through and talk about from Columbine on, all the statements that are there in this. You know, obviously we don't know it for all of them because not all of them have left records with regard to this, but that would be the closest I would say to anecdotal stuff. Now, you know, as far as refereed, published statistical evidence, as I say, Bill Landis and I have looked at all the mass public shootings over a couple decades, try to control for changes in multiple different types of gun control laws, try to account for factors like changing policing policy and arrest rates. You know, the interesting thing to me is that normal policing, while it's extremely important in deterring crime generally, seem to have no impact on these mass public shootings. And there seemed to be a simple reason for that, and that is virtually all these guys planned on dying in the attack. About 75% of these killers die at the scene, either committing suicide or being killed by someone else. And even the 25% who lived planned on committing suicide, but just couldn't bring themselves at the last moment to go pull the trigger. And so the thing is, if you're planning on killing yourself, this notion of whether law enforcement's going to catch you or likely to catch people is pretty irrelevant. Law enforcement basically deals with punishing and things after the fact. And in these guys' minds, it's not a relevant concern. So the basic data is the behavior permit holders, okay? What risk do they represent being in an area? Because you have to measure both the costs and the benefits. And also, the fact that these killers, both statistically in terms of looking at just the rate at which these crimes occur, and then anecdotally to the extent that they explicitly make statements, are purposely picking out these places where victims aren't able to go and defend themselves. And that, to me, seems the trade-off that's involved here.
Okay. Senator Green, quick, brief question. Now, one of the Detroit papers was pretty careless with the headline today, and they mentioned churches. Your legislation does not affect churches at all. They're treated like a